Is drinking raw milk safe like RFK Jr. suggests? Can you reduce a glucose spike if you eat your food in, quote-unquote, the right order? I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp. I host a nutrition myth-busting podcast called Bite Back with Abby Sharp. And those are just some of the questions I tackle with qualified experts on my show. There is so much food misinformation and disinformation out there, and it can feel impossible to know what's real and what's BS. On Bite Back, my goal is to help listeners create a pleasurable relationship with food, their body, and themselves, which in my opinion is the fundamental secret to good health. Listen to Bite Back wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's being billed as the largest increase to Canada's military since the Second World War.
I'm announcing today that Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule.
It's no secret that the Canadian Armed Forces have been neglected over the past number of decades. The challenges are well known. Outdated equipment, broken down vehicles, aging planes, ships in dry dock, a massive shortage of personnel. Canada's military preparedness has been allowed to atrophy as government priorities shifted elsewhere in the post-Cold War era. Now, the Mark Carney government says it's time to rearm and re-equip Canadian troops in the face of a more dangerous and chaotic world.
The long-held view that Canada's geographic location will protect us is becoming increasingly archaic. Threats which felt far away and remote are now immediate and acute. And as our climate changes and the polar ice recedes, Canada's Arctic is becoming more accessible and more vulnerable to commercial and military activity.
So, what goes into a multi-billion-dollar overhaul of a modern military? And is Carney's plan right for Canada? Let's find out. I'm David Smith, today on The Big Story, digging into the big plan to revamp and revitalize Canada's national defense. I'm joined today by Richard Shimooka, expert in Canadian defense policy, senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Hi, Richard. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm sure you were listening closely to the Prime Minister last week when he outlined the new plan for defense spending in Canada. On the whole, what do you think of it? Is this plan moving in the right direction?
I think it's a high-level political statement. It was pretty good. I know from sort of personal feedback that I received from people within the defense establishment, a lot of them are sort of hopeful for the nature of his comments and the thrust of this sort of broad goals that he outlined. But sort of the problem is that there's a lot of details that need to be fleshed out. And this has constantly been the problem with Canadian defense policy, is that sure, at many times we've had, strong, platitudes been thrown out about this is a critical sort of priority for a government, right? You can think about the Harper era, right? But over time, the actual details either are outlined and they don't come true, or they're not even outlined and they don't come true, obviously. So I think that we're kind of at that stage. There's been some areas where it's been positive, that there is some detail, but still much more needs to be identified, fleshed out, and worked on in order to actually see real results.
Yeah, and you mentioned the high-level political statement that's happening here. There's a lot that's gone into this announcement at this time. How much do you think the timing of it has to do with not only the G7 summit happening in Canada right now, but also the NATO summit happening later this month?
Oh, I'd add to that also the sort of ongoing discussions with the Trump administration, so which may be announced by the time this comes out or not. We'll see. So certainly, I think that's maybe the overriding sort of thrust of the reason why this occurred. If we think about the Prime Minister's predecessor, Justin Trudeau, multiple different NATO meetings, G7 meetings, showed up and expresses reticence, if not utter sort of disregard of the tenor of those meetings, where they say, look, we have real security challenges like in Ukraine, like in Taiwan. We need you to get to 2%. And as the Washington Post reported a couple of years ago, he said no, just flat out no, right? And so going into these meetings, many of which are going to be contentious, many of which are actually discussing higher targets. NATO is considering a 5% target. We can get into whether or not that's realistic or not, but a lot of these are going beyond 2%. For him to show up and say, look, I'm going to hit 2% by the end of this fiscal year, I think gives them a bit more leverage, at least a little more wiggle room than his predecessor. So we're not basically the outlier that's going to be excoriated by all the partners, and he can help sort of keep the discussions moving along rather than being the sort of the object of the discussions themselves.
Right. So it's kind of what Prime Minister Carney has done is shown off the bat and send a signal to our allies that this is a new government. He is not Justin Trudeau. And by making this commitment now, he's trying to signal to Canada's defense partners that things have changed, that we are serious about living up to some of our obligations under this alliance.
Certainly at the sort of the high level, one of the core problems, I think, though, is that 2% is a guideline. It's a really imprecise figure. And part of the reason that it's highlighted by our allies is because they, in public at least, they don't want to be impolitic. They want to be diplomatic in the sense that they're not telling various countries exactly what they should do and all that, right? But I think they are very, very knowledgeable of like what is actually Canada bringing to the defense, to defense in general, right? Like what are the precise capabilities? How many fighters? How many troops? These sort of hard numbers and hard figures, and that's the area where Canada's really got some issues, like some pretty serious lack of capability. That sure we're hitting the 2% mark, but the actual sort of the bang for the defense buck that we have is quite low. And so there's going to be a bit of a sort of asymmetry where you see, yeah, sure, you're hitting this mark and you're committing to do more. However, what are you actually providing, let's say, to the defense of Eastern Europe or in the Western Pacific against greater Chinese aggression? There's a real sort of separation between the two, and the actual announcement and sort of the parts of it really don't get at some of the really core deficiencies that Canadian Armed Forces have.
Yeah, and when you speak about details that are lacking at this point, is that what you're referencing? Actual hard numbers of, this many bombs, this many fighters, this many troops on the ground. That's the stuff that's not in this announcement.
True, but also a plan to get us to some of those areas. So one of the core issues that we see is that actual program implementation. How long is it going to take to get some of the new capabilities that they're considering, or improving the overall process, right? For whether it be training or bringing recruits or identifying and then buying equipment, right? That's not part of this, right? And while they have delegated Stephen Fuhr, MP, to become basically a head of a defense procurement agency, the details for that is not there, right? And now we have to be fair. That's not going to come basically just a month and a bit after an election. It does take time to put these things through. And I think that's part of the reason why, going back to what we said before, that this is done right before these critical meetings, so that he has some sort of deliverable there to sort of massage those meetings. But it's really, those are the questions that are really critical going forward, because you can identify, we're going to buy, let's say, submarines, right? But if that program is going to take 10 years to execute or more, a lot of the allies are going to be like, well, that's just not helpful, because we know our window of vulnerability, let's say in the Western Pacific, is basically starting now for the next 10 years. And you're just not going to be part of any of those defense plans or those defense sort of the security architecture that's going to help, deter greater aggression against, either South Korea or Taiwan.
Okay. So, what the Carney government has committed to in terms of dollars and cents is increasing defense spending to $62.7 billion by the end of the 2025-2026 fiscal year. That figure represents an increase of about $23 billion over last year. I want to get your take on some of the accounting that goes into that figure. There is $9 billion, a little more than $9 billion in actual new spending this year. But then the other 14 odd billion is coming from what they call defense or security related spending from other government departments that's being brought into the accounting of the Department of National Defense, the overall defense budget. It's a little unclear how that works, what exactly that means. So what do you make of that?
Well, the biggest one that has been identified is that the Coast Guard is basically being pulled into Department of National Defense out of fisheries and oceans, which I think there's two ways to look at this. Now, if we think about what's going on in the Western Pacific and like the South China Sea, we think about other sort of Coast Guard organizations, let's say Japan or the United States. Coast Guards actually play a pretty important role in security, right? We've seen the growth of what we call gray zone actors, maritime militias, or sort of deputized fishing fleets that sort of act somewhat as security or as sort of threats to whether it be overfishing or sort of disputed territory areas, right? And so Coast Guards can play a role in these areas, and they quite frequently do. So in some ways, bringing that into the defense spending fold is not a bad thing, right? I think that's a fair sort of assessment, and there's been changes at NATO that allow that to occur and to make that accounting acceptable, right? At the same time, going back to about what we were talking about earlier about actual defense capabilities, it doesn't mean any change in defense capabilities. We're just doing what I would describe as just a nice accounting trick, right? So, and it doesn't really reassure our allies that we're actually doing more, especially given that we have very, very little that we can actually provide, whether it be only 2,000 troops that is deployed for deployment in Latvia or just a couple fighters on alert to defend the northern airspace. Those are the things that are real hard capabilities, and Canada just doesn't have those. And changing accounting rules to allow us to account more doesn't move the needle, I think, for any of our allies in that way.
One of the questions Prime Minister Carney's faced in the wake of this announcement was around how much of this new defense spending from the Canadian government may see Canadian tax dollars flow into the U.S. Politically speaking, some people may not like the idea of pouring billions of Canadian dollars into U.S. defense firms at this particular moment in time. Carney has said part of his plan involves reducing our dependence on the U.S. for defense, but the U.S. represents some 40% of the global defense industry. So how much of a challenge will that be?
It's a pretty serious one. So going back to what we talked about before about Europe, and this will explain. So you have this very sort of a very sort of bureaucratic model of how you do industry. The Canadian industry's exposure to the United States is actually really high, and that's partly because in the 1950s, Canada made a free trade agreement essentially with the United States called the Defense Production Sharing Act, which basically allows Canadian firms to act as if they were American firms and join programs across the U.S. Defense ecosystem. So what is happening is that for many, many years, companies that produce parts, if they're go back to this best value model, the best part available, the best system available, they can compete on an American program, even though Canada would never buy that system. So give you an example. There's a company in Burnaby called OSI Systems. They're basically the world leader in bridge systems. So if you think about, controlling a vessel, the visuals and all that, they're all built. Their OSI system is one of the best manufacturers of this. And so they're included on Virginia-class nuclear submarines. They are part of the Zumwalt-class destroyer or the Arleigh-Burke-class destroyer. These are ships that Canada will never buy, but yet OSI Systems builds those parts, right? And there are many, many firms in Canada that are really heavily invested in the U.S. defense industry, right? And for a lot of them, they see the DoD as or Department of Defense as being basically, if not as good or a better sort of buyer than the Canadian government because they're given development funding. They have a clear path to getting their systems onto U.S. programs, and this has been a pretty big area of Canadian defense industry sort of growth in for basically several decades. So in some ways there's an organic element to it that's not linked to buying, specific systems in Canada or specific the Canadian government buying specific systems in the United States. A large portion of this is actually stuff that just happens on a day-to-day basis. Canadian firms are actually really good at what they do. Um, for Canada buying systems, yes, what happens, there's another part to this is that the US government is actually a pretty good partner for any country that buys them. US systems, for a majority of them, are actually bought through a process called the foreign military sales process, which what happens is that the US government acts as basically the buyer for a foreign country of their systems, and they ensure that the country gets a piece of equipment that works, that they get all the training, the support equipment, all the sort of ancillary things you need to actually have a defense capability, because they're not so concerned about the profit margin. They're actually concerned about what is the security and defense outcome of these systems. So I'll give you a great example, is the C-17, which is our main strategic airlifter. That was bought for the most part through the FMS process. And the US government insures, they even have like a specialized hub where they ensure maintenance is done correctly to ensure that Canada has basically the best as they would have, best as they have, and it's sold at basically the same price as the U.S. government would get, which gives them a lot more leverage, or any government a lot more leverage, a foreign government a lot more leverage in actually acquiring these systems. So there's a real difference between how the U.S. government operates versus other areas, and that's part of the reason why the Canadian military has been quite happy to just buy systems through FMS. They get better bang for their buck when they go through it. They get the systems that they want, and there's also the question about interoperability, because we work with the United States so closely on, let's say, NORAD and our Arctic security, or let's say sort of defense in NATO and whatnot. Having an American system eases a lot of the ability to work with them closely, but also logistics. So let's say if we were going to fight in the Western Pacific and we have our ships in operating Japan, we don't necessarily have to actually provide the munitions. We can just tack on to the U.S. logistics pipeline and get our equipment. So that's been a real driver for getting U.S. systems. And so trying to reduce the reliance on it presents a lot of dangers, right? Let's say we were to buy a submarine that was built in Europe and uses European systems, and then we have to use it, in the Western Pacific. Then we're basically on the hook for getting all the equipment, all the munitions and whatever for that submarine across, two oceans to get it operate. Or if we bought, let's say, a system that is interoperable with the American logistics pipeline, we would just have to take it off the dock right there. So those are some of the challenges that you see, and that's why Canada has had such a reliance on American systems, and reducing it presents other problems that we'd have to deal with when we acquire them.
Okay, very interesting. Another area that the Prime Minister highlighted as a priority with this new spending is the Arctic. He said that as polar ice recedes with climate change, Canada's Arctic is becoming, quote, more accessible and more vulnerable to commercial and military activity. Would you say that's an accurate characterization? Are we vulnerable in the Arctic?
There's a bit of nuance there that I'd probably say. The idea that you could have commercial shipping going through the Arctic is a lot less than people realize. It's actually longer. A lot of the transit times are not that much better, and they're quite difficult, even with less sea ice. You will see greater sort of economic exploitation, fishing potentially, and other areas that do make it more vulnerable in those sort of senses. Militarily, you have seen the Russian Federation develop very long range long-range cruise missiles that are designed to operate on submarines that would basically be in the Arctic and then try to launch them over through North America through there. So there are vulnerabilities that exist. They have a lot of new, what we call exotic strategic weapons that do go through the Arctic, at least over top of them, maybe at lower altitudes too. So there are greater threats there. But I think Arctic is global warming has made the Arctic changed what is the security challenges in the Arctic. I don't know if they are as severe as some have claimed, or specifically what the prime minister is claiming, but they do require a change in the sort of defense mix or security mix that we have that are able to defend that region.
Okay. And let's end on this for today. There is a NATO summit this week, the annual summit. The leaders of the alliance will be meeting at The Hague in the Netherlands. What will they be talking about? What do you think the top line agenda item will be? Is it the GDP spending ratio, possibly moving that to 5%? Do you think that'll be sort of the main topic of discussion?
Well, with the Trump administration or Trump himself there, you never know, right? It's always a bit of a question mark. I certainly think that the recent attack on Iran by Israel is going to have a discussion on there. But the 5% certainly is the one I think that is the headline. And going back to what we said at the start of the discussion is that the percentage numbers are often used as just a sort of a broad metric of much more in-depth measures of what is defense capability. And that's a pretty headline goal. Now, the U.S. isn't even close themselves to this, even with some creative accounting there too. It's not going to be the case, and I don't think that they're likely to actually hit that. The United Kingdom, for example, is looking at 3% in a couple years' time, based on their defense review, and I think for a lot of countries, going to 5 it's just too much guns and not enough butter for their societies, especially in. We're coming out of COVID and the sort of stimulus spending there. Many countries are pretty heavily debt laden that are just a 5% figure is just unreachable. So I think that will be a discussion point. Something, let's say 3 or 4% is maybe something that's much more likely to be sort of discussed or hit. The other area is the rise of China and also Russia. We can see just the difficulty the Trump administration has trying to even get any sort of agreement on Ukraine, right? And so how to deal with Russia, how to deal with that problem, which seems to have taken a little bit of the back burner in the past couple of weeks here, despite some significant moves. I think the Trump administration just doesn't see the potential for them to actually get the peace deal that they want. And so we're kind of in a kind of holding pattern where Russia has spent itself pretty heavily into this area. They're not going to see big gains. But what is NATO going to do about it? What are these NATO allies going to do? Maybe not through NATO, but like collectively outside of NATO. And those discussions will be raised at NATO and to figure out how can we move forward and sort of keeping ourselves secure and dealing with the Russian threat and helping Ukraine ultimately win this really ugly war this war of aggression against them. And I think that's probably going to be a pretty major area because a lot of these countries, even though the Trump administration doesn't want to talk about it, a lot of them do and want to find a way to ultimately claim victory in this really brutal struggle. Okay. That is our time for today's episode. Richard Shimooka, thank you so much for joining us here on The Big Story again. So grateful for your insight and analysis as we try to unpack this major revamp of Canada's defense spending. And we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll watch for news out of the NATO summit later this week. Richard, thank you so much again. Thanks for having me.
And again, that is Richard Shimooka, expert on Canadian defense policy and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And that is The Big Story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or wherever else you get your podcasts. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.